All right, I am online now. I apologize, guys. I originally set this up to go out on my Safari account, and once I got everything going, I realized that YouTube Live does not support Safari. So give me just a minute here. I'm going to get things set up here. Sorry, I'm a couple minutes behind. Okay. Trying to do two things at once. All right, so basically I've had a bunch of you guys send me questions. I'm going to start with those, and I'll work my way through. The best way you can send me questions, honestly, is the way you've been doing it on Remind, and it comes across as a text message. So I can just start on those and go right in order as they come in. I think... So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I will keep checking the page to make sure no one's posting online. If you, feel free, you can post online. I'm just going to be jumping back and forth between screens. So if I don't see it right away, I will catch it. So don't worry about that. A lot of these are repeat questions. So if I don't specifically say your specific question, more than likely I am hitting it on another person's question. So we'll just work through with this. The first question, it's a list of questions. Could you go over everything the New Deal did for the United States? What all did President Hoover do to help stop the Great Depression? And do we have to know everything about President Truman in regards to ending World War II? All right, as far as the New Deal, what it did for the United States was it got us through the Depression. FDR's 3R program of relief, recovery, and reform. His plan was that was going to get us out of the Depression, but what it did was it just bought us time. A lot of the relief programs that he set up, like the CCC or the WPA, and those were just temporary jobs. So it got people working, it got them earning an income, and overall, I think what the New Deal did for America was it raised the hope of America, but it didn't bring an end to the Depression. It was a Band-Aid on the economic situation that we had at that point. Hoover, when he was in office and the Great Depression hit, he did several things. Actually, he passed the Reconstruction Finance Administration, which is going to basically put more money into the economy. He actually introduced the bank closure bill, but that didn't work. So, or that was turned down by FDR. Because you remember correctly, I told you that FDR, when Hoover sent him the idea, he said no to it. And then Hoover also put in a lot of works projects. He that's how we got the Hoover Dam. That's how we got the aqueduct system in LA. That's how we got the Golden Gate Bridge. All of those were work projects that Hoover put in as president to try to alleviate the Great Depression and basically stop the rise of unemployment. But as we know, when he left office, unemployment was nearing 25%. And so when FDR came in, he introduced those relief programs, and that's going to be what gets us through the Depression. But like I've said before, it doesn't solve the Depression. It doesn't do anything new as far as or doesn't reduce unemployment or anything like that. It just buys us time. So there's that. The next question was what do we need to have to know everything President Truman did in regards to ending World War II? He dropped the bomb. That was it. I mean, when he took office, FDR had already negotiated into the war in Europe, and when it came to the war in Japan, we were expecting help from Russia or the Soviets. We were thinking they were going to come in and help us, but we ended up not needing them because of the successful test of the atomic bomb. So hopefully that answered that question. Going on to the next one. I got a whole bunch of here from Megan here. What do you need to know about women's contributions to World War II? Basically what they were. I mean, they worked in the factories. They worked in the military. They stepped in when the men had to go and fight. The iconic poster that we looked at, Rosie the Riveter, kind of captures the idea of women's role during that war. Is they worked in those jobs so men could go fight. And whether it was in the factory, whether it's administrative jobs, wherever they could fill in, that's where they went. Also at home, they made sure that victory gardens were being planted. They took that pledge to respect the rations and pay only what the government ceilings were set at, and not, sell their ration tickets and stuff like that. So that was their role. What caused the war to end in Europe? I mean, it was honestly, it started, the turnaround was when the Soviets stopped Germany from going any further into, the Soviet Union. So winter helped. And then also the entry of the United States is going to allow the Soviets to focus on the Eastern Front against Germany, and the United States and England to be fighting against Germany on the Western Front. If you want to pick a specific day when things start turning around, when, the beginning of the end, I guess I would pick D-Day, which was June 6, 1944. And that's when we, had the successful invasion at the Normandy beaches in France. And then we will continue on over the next few months and regain and liberate France from German holds. So, so basically what we see there is once we get France, and once the Soviets get Poland, and then we also, I mean, there was a whole bunch of stages, but, it was just a matter of the United States coming in, and we were able to focus our efforts in different parts of Europe instead of just fighting on one front. What did the big three really do? I mean, they're the leaders of the free world. I mean, you have Churchill in England, FDR here in the United States, and Stalin in the Soviet Union, and they're the ones that are going to guide this entire war. So that's basically it on that. Next question, can I go over FDR's first 100 days? FDR's first 100 days was about focusing on relief, getting immediate relief to the people of America. He's going to start that with the bank closures. He's going to close down the banks and make sure they're inspected, and make sure that they are operating effectively. And once the government agreed to reopen the doors to the bank, that tells the American people it's safe for them to put money back in. He also had the government send relief checks to, I think, the lower 15% of the economic class, to just kind of give them some help. And then, of course, the programs he's going to start, you need to know FDIC, you need to know CCC, you need to know AAA, the NRA. Those are the programs he put in place to, the FDIC to protect the banks, the CCC to get people to work. Those are shovel-ready jobs. Whatever it took, he was going to give people, work just to get, so they can start earning money. And so just be familiar with some of those alphabet soup programs that we talked about in class. And I think you'll be fine with that. So that was his first 100 days. And that's what we use to measure presidents from that point on, because we never really looked at the first 100 days. So we need to look at that. Next question. All right, here we go. I got a list of questions here, so let's just get started. Is FDR the main president you need to know about? No, you need to know about Hoover, and you need to know about Truman. Now, FDR encompasses the majority of the time we're talking about. I mean, he's going to go, he served 4 terms. Hoover, is going to serve 3 terms, and we're just going to see his approach and towards the Great Depression. Now, remember, Hoover was more of he was a progressive president. He wanted to see less involvement in the government, but that doesn't mean he had a laissez-faire attitude when it came to the Great Depression. He just was maybe he was just a little bit slow to act. I'm not sure, but he didn't get the support. Well, number one, he didn't get the support he needed from the Congress, because we had a Democratic Congress. So when he's putting plans and stuff in, they're saying no. So he was kind of up against the wall right there. FDR, make sure you're familiar with what he does during the Great Depression, and also how he deals with what's going on over in Europe. I mean, we had the Neutrality Acts passed, but he had to find a way to get around those neutrality pacts. So just be familiar with that. Let me get some of these more. I already talked about the first 100 days. What do you have to know about FDR's court packing scheme? And that kind of goes along with the next question about Butler versus the United States and Schechter versus Poultry Corporation. All right, so let's talk briefly about that. You have the AAA, which is the American Agricultural Administration, and the NIRA, which is the National Recovery Administration. And what both of those were put in place to do is, one, the AAA was there to help the farmers, and the NRA was there to help. What the NRA did was it basically started setting, well, price fixing for lack of a better term. During the Great Depression versus the World War II, the government is going to try to set fixed prices on different materials. Now, they're not allowed to get away with it during the Great Depression because we're not at war, quite honestly. So what happened is in Schechter, Schechter Poultry versus the United States, the government ruled that the Supreme Court ruled that the government had overstepped his bounds with regards to the Interstate Commerce Clause. Hold off on the questions just for a few minutes, guys. I got to get through. I got about 50 questions here, and I need to get through them. And a lot of you guys are asking a lot of double questions, and I don't want you to just shoot me terms from your review sheet. Okay, I'm not going to give you your definitions tonight. All right, so back to Schechter versus Schechter Poultry versus the United States. The government said, or what the government did is they set price ceilings on various goods for American people. The Supreme Court said that under the Interstate Commerce Clause, in this situation, the government did not have the right to do that, so they declared the NRA unconstitutional. Tie that to the AAA, the Agricultural Assistance Administration. What we tried to do there, or what FDR tried to do there, was set it up where it would be easier for the farmers to get loans and stuff like that during this time period. Well, the Supreme Court came in that one and said that the federal government was stepping on state powers with regards to loans and stuff like that. So that one was declared unconstitutional. This is going to lead FDR to push for what we call his court packing scheme. He pushed for a bill to be passed that would allow Congress to add justices to the Supreme Court. And the way they phrased it was for every justice that was over 70 years old on the Supreme Court, FDR would be allowed to appoint a new judge. This, if that had gone through, that would have resulted in 6 new justices being appointed to the Supreme Court. Well, basically what that would do, since 6 new justices were coming onto the Supreme Court, and FDR already had the backing of about 3, maybe 4 justices who voted for him in the previous cases, even though he still lost, that would give him basically a majority on the Supreme Court. So what would happen was we would have a Democrat as the president, we'd have a democratically controlled Congress, and then we'd also have, in a sense, even though justice is supposed to be blind, we would have a Supreme Court run or with the majority of people who was appointed by the Democratic president. So fortunately, Congress saw what FDR was trying to do, and they voted down this idea of the court packing scheme. The idea being that each of these branches are supposed to work separately of one another. And what FDR was trying to do was get control of the Supreme Court because, quite honestly, he was angry that they declared some of his New Deal legislation to be unconstitutional. Next question. Are the Washington Naval Conference, Dawes Plan, and Kellogg-Brown Pact going to be on this test in terms of knowing about neutrality? Yeah, absolutely. They might not be a direct question, but they're definitely going to be parts of the stimulus that you're going to be looking at, because a lot of the decisions that the United States makes with foreign policy tie directly to what happened in the 1920s with those 3 legislative actions. For instance, the Dawes Plan, because of the Depression, we're going to see the Smoot-Hawley tariff being passed. And that's another thing that happened under Hoover's presidency. With that tariff, we're going to see the highest tariff rates ever in history. And that's going to limit how many goods Europeans can sell in our country. By this point, European markets are dependent on the Americans for sales and stuff. So this is going to cut into them. They're not going to be making any money. So that's going to make it hard for their government to raise revenue to pay off the loans they owe to us. On top of that, we're not going to be able to send loan money over to Germany. Remember, the Dawes Plan was set up as a way to grease the wheels of the economics in Europe, where we would loan money to Germany. They would then pay off France and England, who would then pay us off for war debt from World War I. So that plan kind of comes to a screeching halt, which hurts everybody. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, I mean, you know about it, but we also know that that had no power behind it. So if you're familiar with it, you should be okay. And the Naval Conference, well, what that's going to do is that's going to give us I guess, leverage to go and negotiate with Japan when they start moving into Manchuria and China, saying, hey, listen, we had that 4 powers treaty. We had the 9 powers treaty. Why are you violating that now? So I guess, so it does play a role. Does it play a direct role into what happens going into World War II? Probably not. But it does set the stage for America being that world power that we're looking at. Major battles you need to know. Major battles, invasions that do we need to know that aren't involving the United States? Okay, be familiar with obviously the invasion of Poland, and that's a direct response to the non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviet Union, in which Germany and the Soviet Union made a secret bargain where Germany's going to invade Poland, and the Soviet promises not to get involved. They're not going to get involved in the war at all, and in response, Germany promises the Soviet Union they will not invade the Soviet Union later. So the fall of Poland into the hands of both Germany and the Soviet Union is the catalyst for Great Britain declaring war on Germany. The Soviet Union does remain neutral. I don't want you to think that the Soviet Union ever allied itself with the Axis powers. It just promised Germany that it would stay neutral during this time. I would also understand the Japanese movements in Asia, their invasion of Manchuria, their invasion of China, and what result that's going to have on the United States-Japanese relations. And because all of that, it directly leads to the United States putting sanctions against Japan because they're not because they're violating the treaties, because they're not respecting the sovereignty of China and stuff like that. And so what we're going to see happen is we're going to put sanctions on China or on Japan, such as, freezing their assets in the United States, placing an embargo on any oil or gas deliveries that are going over to Japan, which they rely on. And that's going to directly lead to Japan bombing Pearl Harbor. The NII committee is the next question I have. And the NII committee, basically, that was the committee set up by Gerald Nye. He was I believe, a senator from North Dakota, investigating why we went into World War I. And basically, the conclusions they came up with was the United States entered World War I because we were selling weapons to belligerent countries and because we were giving loans to belligerent countries. And so they blamed those weapons makers and those banks for pulling the United States into the war. And due to that, that's why they passed the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, which made it illegal to do the exact same actions, that we had done prior to World War I. And the whole idea behind the NII committee was to learn from our mistakes so we didn't find ourselves entering into another world war. The next question, what was the WWII program or the WWII campaign? That was a civil rights movement instigated by the African Americans during the 1940s with regards to World War II. If you remember correctly, I read a poem from Langston Hughes that questioned the government, saying, yeah, we're willing to go and fight for democracy across the world, but why don't we have democracy here? And so what the idea was is the WWII program, guys, stop sending the questions, okay? The WWII programs basically said we want victory in Europe and then in this war, and then we also want victory in America too. So we're going to go fight, overseas. And remember, African Americans were given the ability. They were allowed to be in combat units during World War II, which is a complete difference than World War I. And in doing so, they went and they fought over in World War II in Europe, and they fought in the Pacific. But the plan was they're going to come back and keep fighting for the same equality and democracy here in America that they were fighting for over in the European countries. So that's the WWII program. The Bataan Death March, it's not important in the sense that you need to know a whole lot about it. But the Bataan Death March was what happened in the Philippines when the Japanese overtook the Philippine Islands. They captured the American soldiers and took them on a 60-mile death march through the jungles to a prisoner of war camp, and mistreated our soldiers. And nearly 5,000 died on the trail, whether they were shot, stabbed, killed, beheaded. They starved, dehydration. When they were liberated, they were, these men were barely alive because they had been starved to death. So that's the Bataan Death March. That was at the early stages of the war in the Pacific, 1942. It just shows that we're fighting a different style of war than what we've been fighting before. And this one, it's pretty gruesome what happened to those men. And then finally, okay, that one you already answered that question. Okay, next question. We're going up here. Let's see. Do you need to know any specifics about the Nuremberg trials? Just know that they happened. I didn't go into real depth in class. I would just be familiar with why they happened and who they were targeting and what the, I mean, it was Nazi war criminals that were being put on trial. And so why were they put on trial? Just be familiar with that. The Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference basically very important with regards to the outcome of the war in Europe, because what happened at the Yalta Conference was the big three got together. They determined what they wanted. Now, remember, going into the Yalta Conference, and if you don't have access to it, follow that Epic 1787 _ boards, and I have a picture of the whiteboard of what I drew up there, what everybody wanted and what they ended up getting. Remember, the United States just wanted help fighting the Japanese. The British wanted a free and democratic Poland, and the Soviet Union wanted satellite nations. They wanted nations to create a buffer around their territory so they wouldn't have to worry about getting invaded again. What they came out with was they decided that they would settle for nothing less than unconditional surrender of Germany. They created the UN with the Security Council, giving the three nations plus China and France veto power on that Security Council. They divided Germany, and that's probably the big thing, the big idea that came out of the Yalta Conference is Germany was going to be divided into 4 sections to be controlled by the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and the United States. This is going to be the first step towards the Cold War. So the decisions they make, Flint's got an early start tonight. The decisions they make at Yalta will lead to the Cold War immediately, because while Stalin promises free elections in Europe, it's a complete lie, because almost a week after, he's going to jail the Polish government, put them in jail, and he's going to take control, and Poland will from that point on be a Soviet satellite nation. So that's why Yalta is so important. Let's see, the other question you had, this dog is in the way. I already answered the one question about the NRA and the AAA. The Wagner Act was basically passed, I think, in 1935. And what that said was that unions do have the legal right to collectively bargain. They do have the legal right to organize. So the Wagner Act is kind of seen as a declaration of independence, if you will, for unions. It makes unions legal. And so that's going to boost their power in our country. And the other question you had, Maddie, was the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter was a meeting between FDR, oh my gosh, he's getting in my cord here, FDR and Churchill, and they met before we actually got involved in the war. The war is going on in Europe, and I got to put him down. Get down. Get down. Come on, get down. Love you, bud. Good job. All right. The war is already being fought. We're not in it yet, but FDR and Churchill are going to meet and basically set up the parameters of what they're fighting for. And the idea is going to be that they're only fighting for freedom of the seas and fighting to end the war. And they're also going to set up the foundational blocks for the UN that will be established during the Yalta Conference. So, okay, Maddie, I think that's all your questions. Moving on to the next one up. Aaron asks about the Roosevelt Coalition. What that's basically referring to, Aaron, is the coalition that FDR had through the Democratic Party, not only on the federal level, but on the state level and local levels too, to support the New Deal programs. That he basically had a block of Democrats throughout the country, and we talked about how he had control. He had the majority in the House and the Senate, but he also had Democratic coalitions throughout the country that were just there supporting what he was doing with the New Deal. So that's basically all that was. Hannah wants to know, talking about the Navajo code talkers, and when it comes to the Navajo Code Talkers, they basically worked in the Pacific realm or the Pacific theater of the war, and they did exactly what their name said. They were the ones, we used the Navajo language to speak in code, and so we could pass secret messages and stuff like that, and that allowed America or the allies to share messages over the airways. Now, if you remember correctly, when we talked about the Battle of Midway, and I think someone asked about Midway, so I'll go ahead and talk about it right now. Midway was a turning point in the war in the Pacific, because what happened was we had a new technology, a machine called the Enigma machine, that had the ability to crack the code of the Japanese military. And once we cracked that code, we realized that they were planning on attacking Midway, and Nimitz was able to prepare for that attack. And what occurred in that attack was we were able to sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and they only had 10 total when the war started, and we sank 4 of them in this one battle, and Japan went on the retreat at that point. So it shows you the value of being able to break these codes, because militaries talk in code, and generally those codes change every single day in order to prevent them from being broken. Well, with the Navajo Code Talkers, we had Native Americans, part of the Navajo tribe, who actually, put out our messages using their native language. So that's what they were. Okay. Next one is going to be, looks like Andrea's, and she's asking, how much about things non-U.S. I kind of talked about the non-U.S. related things about World War II. Just know the big ideas, what's going on as far as the rise of Hitler, who the main leaders are for each of the countries. Know that a lot of it's going to be centered around Germany and what Hitler's doing and stuff like that. But that's basically the big ideas. You don't need to get into the weeds. You don't need to talk about, like, when we did that Friday, when I talked about the rise of Hitler and how he came into power, that really is not going to be on the test. What we talked about this week, what's on the videos that I made going into World War II, the 1930s, what Hitler was doing as far as, invading the Sudetenland, taking over Czechoslovakia, before Czechoslovakia, negotiating appeasement with Neville Chamberlain. Those are the ideas you need to know about, so for non-U.S. involvement that you should be familiar with. Zaina asked a couple things here. Where are we going? Let me go back up to this. Which of the New Deal agencies are we going to need to know? Basically, you're going to need to know the ones from the first 100 years. Be quiet. I'm working. I'm going to pull something up for you real quick here. If you give me just a second, let me pull this up and see if I can get this up and running. Because I do have a PowerPoint that I can show you that I think would help you. I just need to get it up. There it is right here. Set it up. Talk amongst yourselves. Here we go. That's what I want. Okay. All right. Now what I need to do is I need to share my screen with you so you can see exactly what I'm looking with. Okay. All right. So you should be able to see this now with the New Deal. Now we know that the main idea, the relief, the recovery, and reform is what you need to know about the New Deal. These are the 3 R's. When we talk about the first year, 33, this is where we're talking about his first 100 days. And these are the New Deal programs. These really here you need to know, okay? You need to know FDIC. You need to know NRA or the NIRA, the National Industry Recovery Administration. You need to know the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. You need to know the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And you need to know the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Agency. So those are the ones for the first 100 years that you do need to know. When we go into 1934, FCC, these are not nearly as important to know. I mean, these are great to write about if you can. The one that I would pull out for the 1934 is going to be the SEC. And someone had sent me a question about the SEC, about what you need to know about them. You need to know that the importance of the SEC is they are putting into position safety checks within the stock market trade, because, you know, we have rules now for how stocks can be exchanged and stuff like that. And if we don't follow those rules, then businesses and stuff are often shut down and people can go to jail for that. And so they're going to oversee the business practices of the stock market and bond exchange. Okay. Going into 35, this is when we get into the second New Deal. The second New Deal was, first New Deal wasn't working. We weren't getting out of the Depression. We were seeing our unemployment went down a little bit, but all those jobs were just temporary. So that's when we're going to start seeing safety nets being put in. And that's when Social Security is going to be introduced. That is a safety net for people. So it's stuff like this, when it's created, that America starts becoming dependent on the government to solve problems that in the past we normally wouldn't look for them to solve. You might want to be familiar with the National Youth Administration. I mean, that's not a real big one, but it was created during this time. And so maybe familiar with that. And then, of course, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. This is one, put a star beside it, because this one is where they found jobs for people, maybe non-labor jobs. Like, that's where we talked about the writers and the painters and the artists and the musicians and stuff like that. This is where FDR tried to find jobs for everybody, not just labor-ready jobs, okay? That's when we see Dorothea Lange, her book comes out with regards, following the families in the Dust Bowl and what they were going through. 1937, that's when the court packing scheme happens. That's when AAA and NIRA are determined unconstitutional. And then, like I said, that's the court packing scheme. By the time we get to 1938, and I'm going to come on out of there, by the time we get to 1938, we see the programs ending. Okay, this is when we start to shift and maybe start looking at what's going on overseas, because right now we're in the midst now of passing, neutrality acts and stuff like that. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea about what you need to know as far as the New Deal. So let me get out of this one here. Okay, so I answered those questions. Let me go to the next question. Moving up. Vivian, the key conferences you need to know. There were 3 conferences that occurred between the big 3. The first one was the Tehran Conference, which was in 1943. And then the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference both occurred in 1945. Now, the Tehran Conference in Tehran, Iran, they met, and what they're going to do is discuss how they're fighting this war. Now, the United States is already involved. It's not like, we've been waiting for this conference, but now we're going to start streamlining what we're doing. And what the big 3 agree on at this point is that the Soviet Union is going to focus on fighting Germany on the eastern frontier. So basically, they're going to fight to get Germany out of their country. And then the United States and Great Britain, along with some other smaller allies. I mean, you still have the French, with their exiled military. You have, the Polish fighters and stuff. They're going to focus on Germany on the western frontier. They're going to focus on trying to get Germany out of France and kind of just start squeezing the Germany back towards Berlin. And the idea is they're going to try to attack both sides, both trying to get to Berlin and bring it into this war. Yalta, I already talked about that conference. And then Potsdam, that's going to occur shortly after the European war ends. And at this point, instead of FDR, you're going to have Harry Truman represent the United States, because FDR has passed away. And the Potsdam Conference was a very tense conference because, first of all, you had Winston Churchill to start off with, and then halfway through, he's going to be voted out of office, and David Attlee is going to come in. There is a lot of mistrust between these 3 countries because, remember, at Yalta, Stalin had promised, free and democratic elections in Poland, and that did not happen. So he out and out lied to us. And what we're looking for is those free elections throughout Europe. And we can't even get it in one country. So the tension's going to be high, but Truman kind of has to balance things out because we're still fighting down in the Pacific. And so he needs the help of these other two countries, or so he thinks. Now, once we get, as that conference goes on, we are going to find out that the atomic bomb was successfully tested. And in doing that, Truman now kind of has that ace in his back pocket, and we really don't need the Soviet Union anymore. So that's going to ease a little tension as far as the United States is concerned. But those are the three conferences that you need to know. All right, next question. Moving up. Just talked about three conferences: the Battle of the Bulge and the Battle of Midway. Already talked about Midway and the Bataan Death March. The Battle of the Bulge, what you really need to know about that one is that was Germany's last all-out attempt, offensive move to stop the Allies from moving in from France. We had liberated France, and the German forces are going to meet us in the Ardennes forest, and it's going to be an all-out assault. They're basically just going to throw everything at us but the kitchen sink. And in doing so, at times they are going to basically have an advantage. They are going to, and that's what's going to cause the bulge in the battle line. I mean, basically the way I describe it is, if you picture a line, I'm going to draw you a picture. Look at that. See the power of, let me get a pen here. All right, here's the picture. Can you see it? I don't even know if you can see it. All right. So basically, if this is the battle line coming down, the German offensive, what they're able to do is they're able to push the Allied forces back this way, which causes the battle line to bulge out. And that's how it got this nickname. But then the Allies are going to come back and just push it back. So, it's a bad visual, but I always think of a pregnant woman, honestly, that's how I remember the Battle of the Bulge and what that was all about. But it was the German last offensive to try to stop the Allied forces from getting into Germany from the western frontier, or the western border. U.S. Butler, and I already did that one. Schechter versus United States, I already did that one. The Four Freedoms, we didn't really talk about that in class. You might want to be familiar with it. What Roosevelt was saying in his Four Freedoms speeches is that everyone in the world shares these four freedoms, and they should share these four freedoms that America has. And they were the freedom of speech and expression, the freedom to worship God in their own way, the freedom from want. And that's really a progressive idea. And that's really the freedom from want is really about, that's kind of the New Deal programs that, if you remember correctly, and this is we with Hoover, remember Hoover in his dealing with the Depression, he said Americans should rely on their rugged individualism. FDR is going to introduce a new idea that Americans should rely on their government to help them when times get tough. And that's that freedom from want. He said that all people should have a freedom from want or the need of things. And you could make that argument that that's kind of pushing towards some socialist ideas. And a lot of people are going to argue that we got to pause just for a second. Hold tight. The dog has something he shouldn't have. Hang on. Okay, I'm sorry about that, guys. I don't know how we got this stuff, but he's in trouble now. All right, so this freedom of want, speaking of want, he wants everything he can't have, but the government should protect us from a freedom of want. And then finally, the fourth freedom was a freedom from fear, that we should be able to live in a world without fear. So those are the four freedoms that you should be familiar with. Okay, let me go back to this. Next question. Did that one. I'm getting caught up now. Okay. Already talked about that. Did that. Ishan asked, did women working during World War II directly lead to the feminist movement in the 60s and 70s? I think so. Yeah, I really do. If you think about it, these women who worked during the war, I mentioned in class, these are the same women who are going to procreate the baby boom. And they're going to have daughters who, by the time they get to the early 60s and 70s, they're going to be teenagers and going into their early 20s. And they're growing up with mothers who had these jobs and held down these jobs during war. And they're going to be wondering, why can't I get those jobs now? So they're going to be looking for the same opportunities that their parents had, that their moms had. And so, you know, when they see the independence and stuff that women had during the war, they're going to be looking for the same thing. So yeah, absolutely. I do think it led directly to the feminist movement. Also, I also think that what the African Americans did during World War II is going to spark the civil rights movement. I mean, that whole WWII program is going to really push this idea of civil rights and equality in our country, because, you know, they fought in this war alongside of the white Americans, and now they want the same rights, you know, and rightfully so. So absolutely, I think both Africa or civil rights and the feminist movement got a boost during World War II. All right, here we go. Let's see. SEC, we already covered that. Keynesian economics, you know, you don't need to know directly about it. I would just have a good working knowledge of it. If you just, it's pretty much what a lot of our, I'm going to pull it, see if I can pull up a quick definition that I have here for you. It's, you know, okay, yeah. I mean, you know, it's just what we used, what FDR used during the Great Depression was, you know, coming up with solutions for a short-term, you know, economic solution. So, do you need to know the mechanics of Keynesian economics? No. Do you need to know the mechanics of Adam Smith and his theories? No. Just know that these were the men that inspired. Well, Keynesian inspired FDR and everything that he did during his time in office. All right, I have just gotten through all the questions that were sent to me via text. Now is the time. If you have any others that you want to ask, if you want to post them in the chat, you can push them there, because I have that up and I'm looking at that right now. If you want to text me any other questions, now's the time to go ahead and get that to me, and I'll just hang out here. You know, I'm not going to go all night long, but, you know, I'll stay here for a little longer if you guys do have more questions. So you came up with a lot of good questions. So what else do you have? I'll watch my dog as you're pondering. Okay, it's kind of quiet, so. Okay, did I answer them all? Because I'm not seeing any more and I'm not getting any more text. Are there any questions that you guys had? Oh, here's one. Okay. No, I did not talk about the Stimson Doctrine, Megan. That happened right after Japan invaded Manchuria. And what happened there was the United States, in response to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, passed the Stimson Doctrine. And what we basically said is, we're not going to recognize any government of countries that they took by force. So, for example, the Japanese moved into Manchuria. We are not going to recognize the Japanese government in Manchuria because they forcefully took that country. And so that was just basically our declaration of how we were going to handle this. Now, obviously that didn't bother Japan that much, because they kept pressing on through China. They went down into French Indochina in 1940. So our doctrine did little to stop their advancement, but it did for us. It drew a line in the sand. So, you know, we had reason to basically put those sanctions on Japan when they refused to get out of China. Father Coughlin, I would be familiar with him. Father Coughlin, Huey Long, these are some of the guys who are speaking out against FDR's New Deal. If you remember correctly, Huey Long, in the election of 1936, he would have been a viable candidate. He's going to run against he's planning on running against FDR, and he's the one with the Share the Wealth program, where he promised $5,000 to every family, and a car and a house and a radio and all that. What you need to be familiar with these guys about is the fact that they were opposing FDR and his New Deal program. Now, if you remember correctly, Huey Long, he was assassinated, so we didn't get to see what he was able to do. Father Coughlin was a voice on the radio. He would speak out quite honestly or quite often against the New Deal program. Can I compare trickle down and pump priming? Pump priming is basically what happened. That was that was part of the recovery part of the triple R's, I believe. And basically what pump priming is, Justine, is when we're going to push some money into the economy, hoping to increase spending. The example I used in my classroom is when you're trying to start a small engine, you push a little fuel into the engine and that helps it start up quicker. So what FDR is going to do with the pump priming is the idea is he's going to push, they're going to push some I guess put some money into the system, put more currency out into the system, hoping that will encourage more spending. Also, the idea you can tie that with the relief agencies, that now that Americans are making money, they'll start spending money. Because remember, we talked about this, the economics of the Depression was this cycle that just absolutely came to a halt. As soon as the stock market crashed, people couldn't pay off their loans because remember, they bought a lot of that stock on margin. And when they couldn't pay back the loans, they basically that shut down the banks because the banks aren't bringing in any money. Well, as one bank shut down, then people started making the run on the banks in order to get their money so they don't lose it. Then the banks, once they gave out all their money, they had to shut the doors, and which meant there were a lot of people who deposited money that their money was just gone because it had been given out on loans that weren't paid back. So the idea of pump priming is that what we're going to do is we're going to give Americans, even if they're short-term jobs, we're going to give them jobs to put money in their pocket in order for them to start spending that money again. Once they start spending the money, then businesses will start going again. Once businesses start going again, then they're going to require more goods. And when they require more goods, then factories are going to start kicking back up and everything and reopen. And then when factories reopen, more people can be hired. And once more people get hired, they can get more money. And it just keeps growing and growing and growing. And so that was the idea behind pump priming. Now, trickle down economics is more of this idea where if you give the upper echelon, the large businesses and stuff, tax breaks and stuff, they start reinvesting their money into their business. It's amazing when, and I think this was Andrew Mellon during the 1920s, his plan, during Coolidge's presidency was that if we give tax breaks, people have an idea that they're going to spend more money, because if you think you're going to have high tax responsibilities, if you're going to have to pay a lot of money in taxes, companies tend to hold on to their money. They don't reinvest it in their company. Well, if you give them a tax break, what they tend to do is they say, okay, I don't have to pay as much in taxes now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that money that I would have had to save for taxes. I'm going to reinvest it into my company. And through reinvesting, they grow their company, meaning that they will then have to hire more people, and those people will start making money. So basically that extra money that we gave as a tax break is going to trickle down to the employees and the workers because new jobs are going to be created. So that's a 5-minute, education in economics. And hopefully that helps answer your question, Justine, because I know that's a lot of information to take in. All right, D-Day. I did not talk about D-Day, Zaina. D-Day was June 6, 1944, and that was, I did talk briefly about it, but that was the planned Allied invasion of France. And this was an all-out assault by the Allies. They're going to invade the beaches of Normandy. They're going to be overtake the Germans at those beaches. And once they get those beaches, I remember I showed you in class that picture of the movement of trucks and equipment and everything that was being moved into France. And that's what's going to be used to battle against the Germans and push them out of France. So that's why D-Day was so important. What else do I got here? Okay, I got that one. Trinity. Let's see. I think I already answered that question. Okay, so yeah, I think I got all those. All right. Any other questions? Couple more minutes, I can hang out. Okay. All right, so I think we're about wrapping it up now. If you missed anything last week, I think I told you guys all in class today, I made 4 videos that break down that entire PowerPoint I did last week, and I broke it down. I think you have like the I think I had the Depression. I think I had the New Deal. I did one on the I see it. I'll get it in just a second. Um, I did one on on American neutrality, and I think I did one on World War II. What I'll do, I sent everyone in my class a link to. It's a different YouTube. I put it on my personal YouTube channel. I didn't put it on my school one. On my personal one, literally, I think you can just search H Lennox. You can find it. But what I'll do is when I'm done here, down below in the the explanation or the description of this, I'll go ahead and put a link to those videos so you can watch those and everything. So they'll be there if you wanna look at those. I did get another question. What were war bonds? War bonds are basically, those are just loans that the government sold. They sell them in forms of bonds, and the American people buy it, and they get a document saying you own this war bond, and it's going to be paid back by the government with interest over a certain period of time, and they're going to use that fund to help fund the war. So that's what was. When did we go to war economy? I don't understand that question, Megan. When did we go to war economy? So you're going to have to rephrase that one for me, because I don't understand what you're asking me for that one. So France didn't voluntarily fight. France didn't fight with the Axis powers at all. No. France, that you're a little confused there. I got a question saying, so France didn't voluntarily fight with the Axis. No, France was overtaken by the Axis powers. If you remember correctly, in 1940, Germany is going to invade France, and they're going to invade France through the Ardennes Forest. And what they're going to do is they're going to be able to basically take control of France in a 3-week period of time. Basically, what's going to happen is we're going to see when France falls, they're going to put basically a satellite, or I can't even think of the right term, but their government is going to be operating out of England. They're going to be a government without a country. So they didn't fight with the Axis powers. They were fighting with us. But they were just, like I said, they were an army, and they were a government without a country. So that's what was going on with them. Okay, I understand your question now. Basically, when we switched to a wartime economy, basically we switched from that. Basically, that kind of started in 1941 with the passage of the Lend-Lease Act. We are going to see with the Lend-Lease Act is basically that's when we say we're going to lend equipment and munitions to the Allies, specifically England. So we will start slowly shifting to wartime economy or wartime production in early 1941. But then, of course, once we enter the war, we go full board into wartime production. So the end of 1941 is when you're going to see that switch. Next question. Spanish Civil War. What the importance of the Spanish Civil War on communism is basically the fascists are going to win, but what we're seeing is with the rise, and I'm drawing a Ferdinand, I believe is his name, but with the rise of the dictatorship in Spain, that kind of ties all together with these dictators and this totalitarianism that's rising throughout Europe during the 1930s. I basically talked about Mussolini, Hitler, and Stalin, but you also did have the guy in Spain. You also had Tojo in Japan. You also had someone down in Greece as well. So you had this rise of dictatorships, and it was the battle of what kind of government is going to be. Is it going to be a fascist government, or is it going to be a communist government? The majority of them ended up being fascist governments. The Soviets were really the only one who followed this communist regime, but don't worry, they're going to be able to spread their message very quickly going into the Cold War. So That's what's happening there. Okay? All right, this is going to be my last call. What else do you guys need to know? Be familiar with the neutrality acts. I will tell you that, and how the United States got around them. So, okay. All right, so it's almost 8:30. I'm going to start winding down unless anybody has any more questions. You guys came up with some decent questions. I think we basically got everything covered through your questions. And I didn't have to mess with a lot of PowerPoints, so this went well. Tomorrow you have, it's 38 multiple choice questions, and then you will take the short answer on Wednesday. Just keep in mind, you know, all the stuff we talked about in class. Like I said, if you want to look at my videos that I made, that they basically go of neutrality of the United States through World War II. That I did the voiceovers on those. I didn't do a voiceover on the Great Depression, but my videos are available, or not my videos, my PowerPoints all are available on the website. So all of that will be there. I'm going to go ahead and call it a night. I hope you guys have a good evening, and we will see you tomorrow. All righty? Bye-bye.